Despite what you might think, public transit is a very popular idea in cities across the United States, and not just in the Northeast Corridor. From Durham, North Carolina to Austin, Texas, a ton of cities have come out swinging with big ideas for new electric rail networks, connecting important destinations and neighborhoods across the cities with great public transit. But, and I don't say this lightly, there is a crisis. The US can't build anymore. Both Austin and Charlotte's plans had tons of cold water thrown on them, from funding issues to community and political problems and cost blowouts. That means that North Carolina's GO Triangle light rail system might never happen, and Austin's light rail system has been massively scaled back, when it probably should have been scaled up into a full metro or suburban rail system. Even cities which managed to convince voters to sign up for tax increases for big transit expansions, which in my humble opinion is a very weird way to go about getting funding and public approval for doing a big transit expansion. Costs have ballooned, timelines have slid, and these cities, LA and Seattle for example, face getting a lot less transit a lot later than they bargained for. And in places where progress is being made, it's often debated whether the project is the right one in the right place. From Honolulu's Heart Automated Metro to high-speed rail projects. So how can we get America building and running great public transit? Let's talk about it. I'm Reese and this is RM Transit, a channel about creating great public transit as the foundation for amazing places. If you want to tackle housing costs, mobility, climate change, inequality, and the fact that there are just way too many parking lots around, we need to build more public transit, ideally rapid transit. If you're watching this video, you're probably on board with more and better public transit. And in fact, as it turns out, most Americans are, which actually isn't all that surprising. Public transit is just obviously a good thing to have, and even if you don't use it, it clearly makes your city a better, greener, more affordable, and more interesting place. But there's a big problem. There's a gap between people's desire for more and better public transit and the country's ability to actually deliver that. I think the inability to create great transit and upgrade the transit that already exists, despite what you'll hear from commentators, is not driven by a single factor, whether that be consultants, willingness to sue everything and anything, or even extremely pricey projects. All of these things are major issues, and people need to stop acting like we need to just solve one of them and everything will be rosy. Much in the same way that if we want to manage climate change, we need to dramatically expand public transport. If we want to dramatically expand public transport, then we need to look in the mirror at where projects, processes, and planning are falling far short. And of course, attack those things. I think of getting transit built a lot like a pipeline, where you need to open the valves to get that oh-so-sweet transit flowing. And you're never going to get a lot built unless you get public support, political buy-in, and public agencies capable of delivering major projects. People often act like all you need is political and public support, but if that were the case, then LA and Seattle would be transit paradises right now with all of the funding they've approved to build new projects. But as a byproduct of the often delayed and usually over-budget transit projects these cities pursue, they're just getting a trickle rather than a wave of new transit. While not every advocate needs to get into the nitty-gritty technical details of why we can't get much done even when we have political and public support, some advocates do need to do this. And it's really important that other advocates don't undermine them by suggesting that all we need is more money to spend and more political support. We need to do all of the above, and one valve closing is all it's going to take to stop public transit expansion in its tracks. And to be clear, there's a lot of room for different types of advocates talking about different issues, because the public transit pipes aren't just clogged up in one place, but by a wide range of issues that often means we build the wrong thing for too much money, too slowly, and then don't manage to get a large number of people actually using it. So let's dive into some of these barriers to better transit and talk about how we might go about solving them. One big issue is what transit actually gets built. A lot, and probably too much of the transit discourse in the US talks about the admittedly great streetcar systems of old. You'll often hear things like, if only we kept the streetcars, we'd be so much better off. Maybe even a transit nation. And this is one of those things that I think is both a yes and a probably no. Toronto and a few American cities did keep their streetcars, and while Toronto is admittedly better off than most American cities, it's not exactly a transit paradise, and some days I feel like transit in that city succeeds despite the streetcars, not because of the streetcars. Another city that has kept the streetcar, or more correctly tram, alive is Paris. This city has built an entirely modern tram network since the 90s that has become one of the world's largest. But Paris's trams still don't manage to move even 10% of the region's rail riders, and that's in Paris, a very dense and tram-friendly city. While I think the idea of US cities keeping their streetcars is interesting, it's really just a historical counterfactual. I think people get so into the idea of what was done in the past that they forget to think about what should actually be done in the future. While there are always going to be exceptions, I think the US needs to and should focus on building lots of subways and lots of electric regional rail. These are arguably the transit modes of the future. Far more electric regional rail and subways are being built around the world right now than trams. And their higher speeds and capacities are particularly well suited to the sprawly and transit-light cities of the US. Not to mention their high frequency and ability to be automated, which solves two major problems for American transit: low service and an inability to get staff. It's also possible to build metro at scale. There are cities in China and India that have built more metro in the last 2 decades than the entire US has. And even Paris is embarking on a project right now to build over 120 miles of metro in around a decade. Fortunately, this is a problem that has been tackled before. The US was a leader in cutting-edge metros in the late 20th century, with systems like BART and the DC Metro. And these systems show their value today, with the hundreds of thousands of people they move, their expansive scale, their impressive infrastructure, and their just general popularity. In the future, the US needs to expand systems like DC Metro, MARTA, and BART, not to mention building more similar large-scale metro systems, ideally with intercompatible rolling stock, in other big cities like LA, Dallas, and Denver. But the cost of building stuff is also a major challenge. I covered why subways cost so much in the US in a previous video, but suffice to say, like this video, there isn't a single reason. It's many things. Transit projects in the US are not always, but often overbuilt and ill-conceived. And that's especially true when you consider the mode of transit being built, like Seattle and San Francisco, who've built deep-bore tunnels to run tram-style vehicles in them. Or even alternative projects, like with New York building a giant underground stub-end terminal instead of building through-running regional rail like so many other cities around the world. Even for great projects like the 2nd Avenue subway, massive underground office complexes, running tunnel boring machines with twice the necessary staff, and underground storage areas for dirt from the tunnels so residents who were about to get a subway didn't have to be bothered by dump trucks at night? I'm not going to talk too much about costs, because I and others, including recently Nandert, have covered the issue so much. All I'm going to say is that the issue is real. And no, just spending more is not an option. If it was, New York might have built more than a handful of new subway stations in the last several decades. And that's in a place where at the very least people understand the need for transit and often use it. But there is a silver lining here. If cost problems could be tackled, then the absolutely enormous amounts of money the US is able to mobilize to build new transit could do unimaginable things. LA, for example, would have enough money to build a New York-sized subway system and a modern electric regional rail system. That is, if it could build for the prices seen in less expensive places, which are of course all PPP adjusted, so it doesn't have to do with higher labor costs in the US. There's also the issue of where transit is built. Far too often, transit projects start in low-density areas with not much population instead of in denser urban centers. This risks losing a project in the cradle when it opens and people don't get on board en masse. One example of this is HART in Honolulu, which is very expensive, but a good transit line, but one that won't provide a ton of benefit if it doesn't actually end up getting to the dense places where most people live. It's pretty common and obvious practice to build the most useful parts of a transit project first. For example, most subway systems grow out from the city's center, and most high-speed rail systems start by connecting two major cities, like Tokyo and Osaka, or Paris and Lyon. I think because of the lack of transit construction experience and the political want of getting something built quickly, transit projects often start where it's easier, even if they still end up costing a ton of money for the same reasons. But with projects that start where it's easy, still costing a ton of money, even compared to international examples, you might as well start where transit is actually needed so you get an expensive, but at least useful project. Projects like Denver's electric regional train system and Brightline West show that the US can build technically modern projects, but often away from where they really should be built. But I don't think this is necessarily an issue of understanding where to build transit, so much as a healthy understanding of the trade-offs. For example, sometimes building transit along highways might be worth it if it means connecting more people at the other end, but that's the kind of trade-off that you won't be able to judge if you aren't building a lot of transit. I'd argue that again, the US used to be pretty good at this. Many old transit lines in the country were fairly technically advanced and weaved through all kinds of different urban contexts. Patco in Philadelphia is a great example of this, and there's a great Alan Fisher video on it that you can check out. Modernized systems like Patco across the United States are exactly the type of thing the country needs. And then there's the way the systems are actually run. Far too often, leaders of transit systems in the United States are chosen internally, despite the success of people like Andy Byford who live and breathe transit but aren't from the US. And while it's certainly not true of every system, and there really are great leaders at some transit systems, it's also way too common for transit agency leadership to not actually use transit and instead drive. Plus, and while this isn't necessary, and I'm the first to call out credentialism, it is disappointing that more leaders aren't planners or engineers. Service is also a big issue. While the US often doesn't implement the same technologies seen around the world to allow more service for less, like for example automated trains, governments are also way too stingy and inconsistent with operating funds. That stinginess and a general willingness to cut service on a whim means transit systems often have service which comes in waves. It's possibly good when the economy is doing well, and then it goes into a nosedive, and then it starts to recover, but people don't get used to a good transit service always being available. Well, it's great when transit is running well. If you can afford a car and you know transit service might be cut at any time, you might get that car. And once you have the car, you might get the suburban house. And once you have the suburban house, you're probably not using transit. Part of what leads to inconsistent service is all over the place funding, because transit is often treated like a nice to have that is funded when the economy is running well. That is with things like sales taxes. But that means that when the economy isn't doing well and people aren't going out and buying things, transit might not have funding. And if transit doesn't have funding, there isn't good service, and when there isn't good service, people don't want to rely on transit. This idea of thinking about how service is delivered is really important, especially as companies like Brightline become a bigger part of transit in the US. While I like the service that Brightline provides, it shut down for over a year during COVID. Transit should be seen a lot like sewers, electrical grids, or yes, highways, in that it doesn't shut down unless things are truly on fire. Unless, of course, it's in Chicago, in which case transit being on fire is just perfectly normal. At the end of the day, you're never going to build a transit culture if systems shut down when they're not making money and service levels ebb and flow with the phase of the moon. And speaking of culture, the culture of transit agencies and industry needs to change. North American transit agencies often participate in their own North American industry groups rather than international ones like the UITP. I can't help but think that this closed-off nature, which is especially weird when you realize that North America isn't particularly good at public transit, is probably a big factor in why we always need a Made in North America solution when there are better ones overseas. A bigger classroom where we could learn from systems around the world is obviously a good idea. Now, full disclosure, I have worked with the UITP in the past, but I think the logic here is pretty obvious. We also need to build up more of a public transit ecosystem. If we want more transit, we need to teach and train people about every aspect of it. While there are entire universities in Europe and Asia dedicated to public transport and railways, such institutions are few and far between in North America. But they shouldn't be. If we want great public transit, people need to live and breathe it. They need to speak its language. And being able to be educated at a university or college that is about public transit is one of the ways you do that. And on top of building new stuff, deciding what to build, and changing the culture and service levels of our transit systems, we need to modernize. That looks like making systems fully accessible, automating subways, adding platform screen doors, upgrading stations, and building new transit-oriented development. If this all seems like a lot, it is, but better transit for the US isn't some insurmountable task. Really, the biggest challenge is that there are so many smaller challenges. Tackling them won't be easy, but it's the kind of great effort that solving issues like climate change, inequality, and affordability will take, and we should do it.